country not really taking this title vaccine diplomacy by India very kindly, but I think there is a reason why I'm using it, and let me as I go along, I'll try and explain that also why I'm using this term. Of course, a lot of people are using it, but I started using it some time back. Now, let me set the context as to why India did what it is doing at this point, and which is really intervening in the market for vaccines and ensuring that vaccines are available in as widely as possible, and there aren't any kind of shortages that WTO is talking about. As WTO has often been reminding the global community of the fact that vaccines are not being distributed evenly across countries, and there's a major problem that will hold us back in trying to overcome this pandemic. So the two arguments that I think are very important for to understand where India is coming from is that first is that it's making a very strong pitch for public goods argument, or making this public goods argument, and that is to say that these vaccines should be treated as public goods. They should be made available to all those who actually need them at any point in time, and whoever needs them for free, and at least they should be provided that. And there are many times in the case of medicines also, and India has been supplying medicines to many parts of the world, and not for any other reason. India is known as the pharmacy of the world, that it's able to provide affordable medicines wherever it's needed. And the public goods argument has actually become even more stronger in recent months with the emergence of what we now call vaccine nationalism. We find that in many parts of the world and many major economies, there is this very pronounced tendency to stockpile vaccines well above their actual needs. And I did some calculations. I did some sort of data crunching on this. Now, if you look at the per capita availability of vaccines, and these are February 21 numbers, Canada has contracted or sort of ensured that it would get vaccines 9 times the size of its population, and the UK 6 times, Australia 5 times, and US and EU almost 4 times. So you can see that there are some regions who are actually sort of just stockpiling, and not for any other reason. WHO has been sounding extremely, sort of at times they've been sounding a certain degree of alarm that this kind of vaccine nationalism is taking place. The second argument, the second argument behind India's initiative and reaching out to partners supplying vaccines is this whole development partnership that India has been practicing for decades now. And we know that this whole development partnership that in our own neighborhood started in the 50s, and in the 80s it started expanding to other regions in Africa in particular. And one of the major ways in which India differentiates itself from the traditional aid givers, those countries who give external assistance, is that our what we do for our partners is actually demand driven. It's not a kind of a top-down thing that the Paris Club does, but so we try and meet the requirements of the partner countries as per their wish list. So this is something that India has been talking about, and the Development Partnership Administration coming in 2012 this narrative has actually become stronger now. So these are the two sort of contexts in which India's move must be seen, in my view. And uh, so what has India done actually? When you talk about the vaccine diplomacy, is not just supplying vaccines which I'll just talk about, but there are two major initiatives. And one, of course, is the more something that everyone is talking about, India supplying vaccines. And then the second is, in my view, equally important. There is an initiative that India took in the WTO along with South Africa, and tabled a proposal saying that in these COVID times, as long as this pandemic lasts, um, intellectual property, the four forms of intellectual property, I can elaborate it later, but just for now, I'll talk about it later. But I think the four forms of intellectual property should not be enforced or implemented during these pandemic times. And this is extremely important. I'll just explain in a while, because a lot of the kind of problems of supply that we are finding is because of intellectual property rights, the enforcement of intellectual property rights by these big companies, and this has happened earlier also, and access and availability, affordability of these medicines and also vaccines have become problematic because of these intellectual property rights. So on the vaccine, by making vaccines available, what has India done? We started with Bangladesh. I think this was the third week of January, and other neighbors. So it started supplying vaccines to them, and all these were in grant form. And till date, and this is the data that I got from the MEA website today, this morning, 66 countries have been supplied these vaccines, and 25 of which have received in the form of grant. And most of these are LDCs or low-income countries who have received it in the grant form. More than 58 million doses have been supplied in this period, since the third week of January till now, and 8 million have gone in the form of bilateral grant, and 16 million, more than 16 million, have gone through the WHO COVID-19 vaccine access facility, which is also called as COVAX. So it's not just that we are supplying through the bilateral route, also through the multilateral facility that WHO has set up to ensure that vaccines are available in every country that needs them, and the rest of the 34 million doses have gone commercially. So this is the kind of and if you look at the geographical distribution, it's pretty diverse, in different regions, different continents, from Latin America to Africa to parts of Asia. That's what India has done. So what has India leveraged on? How has India leveraged, and what are the strengths that India has drawn on in order to become a vaccine supplier of this magnitude? The first is, of course, India has the largest vaccine producing facility in the world, which is the Serum Institute of India, and that facility now has been backed by the Bharat Biotech and Indian Council of Medical Research, who have this producing under the brand name Covaxin, and Serum Institute, as you all know, is the Covishield vaccine. Now, the important aspect is that the vaccines that India is producing, these are considered tried and tested, and these are using the technology which have come from the coronavirus, which has episodes of which we saw in the past. And the efficacy of the Indian vaccines is considered to be relatively high. The numbers that we have been given by both the Serum Institute and Bharat Biotech, these have reported an efficacy of 80%, more than 80%. And now, if you consider, if you compare these rates with other vaccine suppliers, and China is a major, is emerging as a major supplier, and through its company Sinopharm. Sinopharm is the major producer of vaccines in China. I've seen reports, because for China, most of this information is not really available. But whatever reports I've seen in the media, the Sinopharm is reporting efficacy of between 50% and 86%. Now, 50.4% and 86%. Now, WHO has set the threshold of 50% efficacy as a bare minimum, below which they won't actually recommend use of these vaccines. So you can see these the threshold that the Chinese vaccines actually reporting. But the major problem, of course, is the lack of transparency, and because of this, I think in several countries there have been certain murmurs that there's also hesitancy in many countries in terms of using the Chinese vaccines. So this is so I'm just giving a brief account of what India is doing, and if there are further questions, I'll be happy to elaborate. Let me talk about the second initiative that India has taken, and as I mentioned, that this was this has been in the WTO. In October, India and South Africa floated this joint paper, which said that all these 4 forms of intellectual property rights, patents, copyrights, designs, and trade secrets, these should be the implementation and enforceability of these 4 forms of intellectual property rights should actually be temporarily waived as long as the pandemic rules. And so we're not talking about any length of any specific length of time, but as long as WHO recognizes this COVID-19 as a pandemic, the argument is that till that time, these 4 forms of intellectual property rights should not be enforced. These should be waived. Now, why is India and South Africa talking? Why did they talk about this? Because right through the 2.5 decades, more than the 2.5 decades in which we have seen that the WTO mandated intellectual property regime operate, we have seen many instances, including the last major pandemic, that the access to medicines became extremely difficult because I'll just try and conclude, Rama. So access to medicines became extremely difficult because of what we call excessive rent seeking on the part of these major pharmaceutical companies. There was a big case in South Africa where most of these major companies challenged South African government, which had enacted legislations in order to provide these medicines cheap to its citizens, and these companies actually challenged the South African companies, and of course eventually the companies lost, and the Indian company Cipla came in and supplied cheap medicines at that point, and that became a major issue. I don't have the time to discuss this. So we have enough evidence with us, and recently WHO has been talking about the excessive prices that cancer drugs are attracting, simply because the intellectual property rights are being enforced in this particular manner. So there's absolutely valid reasons why India and South Africa has moved in the WTO. And till date, as we are speaking, almost 2/3 of the membership of the WTO has actually has endorsed this proposal. And I think, if my memory serves me right, about nearly 60 countries have become co-sponsors of this proposal that India and South Africa had first tabled. Of course, we have seen opposition by the usual suspects, the developed countries, who have stuck to their old narrative of enforcing intellectual property rights, and seeing that the companies earn what they call their incentives for producing medicines. But clearly, these are not the times for these companies to make their big buck at the expense of the population at large. So I think that this what India is doing at this point in time is extremely significant, and these two initiatives are really path-breaking. The WTO process is, of course, not in our hands, but it's important to recognize that our diplomacy has resulted in getting a large number of countries on our side, and we have the backing of such a large number, 2/3 of the membership supporting this. So so this is what I had to sort of say in terms of what India is doing. At this point, I just provided the information and tried to analyze this. But if there are critical comments, I'll be very happy to respond, and I'll stop at that. Thank you, Ramakrishnan.
Thank you, Biswajit. Now I invite Dr. Manoj Joshi to please speak. Yeah, thank you. Manoj?
Thank you, Professor Baru, and Mr. Kantha, and people in the ICS for having me out here. Unlike Professor Dhar, I'm not an expert on anything. Meaning, he's an economist, and he's given you a very balanced and reasoned argument. Mine is more by way of an opinion which I have expressed, and I would like to put it across. And that depends on how you see it, and you're welcome, of course, to critique it. This thing is that in some ways, because we are in a very unusual situation, this whole COVID has upended a lot of things. So in some ways, vaccine diplomacy and vaccine nationalism are two sides of the same coin. But of course, they are manifesting themselves in many ways. In some instances, it is a refusal to share vaccines with anyone, mainly developed countries like the United States. And then, of course, as Biswajit pointed out, this whole business of having more, locking up vaccines far more than you really need. On the other side, it is in the form of giving away doses to enhance the national image, even before you have vaccinated your own people. And I think India and China come to mind out here. Now, from the outset, China has used COVID to push its diplomatic agenda. Last year, when the infection was at its peak, Beijing offered masks, PPE suits, experts to deal with the pandemic to various countries. Of course, we know that at that time, Beijing was also seeking to cover its guilt for delaying informing the world of the pandemic, meaning there was, even now, Beijing seeks to address that issue. Questions still remain on that issue. Now, what Beijing has done is to create a vast supply chain which you can see it originates in a huge facility in the new airport cargo terminal in Addis Ababa airport to aid the vaccine effort in Africa, Middle East, and Latin America. China is, according to its foreign ministry, to supply vaccines to 60 countries, and more than 20 are already using it. And a hallmark of the Chinese diplomacy is that they have managed to persuade Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum, the ruler of Dubai, President Joko Widodo of Indonesia, Turkish President Erdogan, and President Wawel Ramkalawan to take their vaccine, meaning this part of that image process. The Chinese pushing their vaccines has also generated controversy. I mean, so there's been a huge controversy in a country like Peru, where there's an allegation that vaccines were given as perks to VIPs in exchange for a contract to Sinopharm for some 38 million doses. China, of course, has been the first supplier to Pakistan with a gift of 5 lakh doses, as well as a sale of 1.1 million. It will get another 17 million. Pakistan will get another 17 million from COVAX this year, I think by June or July. Now, speaking at his annual press conference at the eve of the National People's Congress, Foreign Minister Wang Yi said that China opposes vaccine nationalism and we reject any vaccine divide between countries. So, all perfectly, in terms of a public posture, you cannot quarrel with the Chinese. He said that China sees the making of vaccines as a public good. And he says from the outset, China had pledged that its vaccines, when available, will be made a public good. So they are punching the right buttons, as you can see. China views itself as a front runner in promoting international vaccine cooperation. I'm citing Wang Yi out here. Wang Yi said that China had carried out R&D and production in a dozen or so countries, attracting 100,000 volunteers, and 17 Chinese vaccines are in clinical trials, and some 60 countries have authorized their use. Now, China is part of COVAX, through which it will provide 10 million doses for use in developing countries. According to Reuters, China has committed itself to providing more than 450 million doses of homemade vaccines through exports and donations this year. Now, of course, we know that where China goes, India can't be far behind. And especially since India produces 3/5 of the world's supply of all kinds of vaccines, and says that it's in the middle. India says that we are in the middle of the world's largest vaccination program. On an average, and this is not just COVID, on an average, India gives out some 400 million shots a year for various ailments like measles, TB, so on. So we have a well-developed vaccine industry. Serum Institute of India, well known, Bharat Biotech, the Covaxin, then Biological E, Cadila, they all have a capacity of making billions of doses of their own or contract manufacturing them for others. As of now, the Serum Institute is, of course, producing the AstraZeneca vaccine, and Indian companies expect to make the Johnson & Johnson, Novavax, and Sputnik 5 vaccine as well. Now, by the second week of February, I know Bishwajit gave you some figures. I had gotten some figures from elsewhere. The second week of February, India had exported some 10.6 million doses to about 20 countries, of which 6.27 or 37% were gifts to friendly countries. So that is an extremely generous gift. That means 37% of the vaccines that you had were given to friendly countries just as gifts. Now, amongst the purchasers were, of course, richer countries: UAE, South Africa, Brazil, Egypt, Morocco, Bangladesh, Algeria, and Kuwait. Bangladesh was number one by 50 lakh, followed by Brazil, Morocco with 20 lakhs each, and South Africa bought some 10 lakh doses, and others bought in smaller quantities. But in addition, Bangladesh also got 20 lakh doses as a gift, followed by Myanmar. Nepal got 15 lakhs, Sri Lanka 10 lakhs, Afghanistan 5 lakhs, Bhutan 1.5, Maldives, Mauritius, Oman, Bahrain, Barbados with 1 lakh each, Dominica with 70,000, Seychelles with 50,000. Though, of course, I couldn't understand why countries like Bahrain and needed any kind of a gift from India. Now, I think just to see how closely vaccine exports are now being linked to foreign policy goals was evident from two visits of External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar, one to Maldives and the other to Mauritius between 20th and 24th February. He carried, in the visit, he carried 1 lakh doses each of vaccines as gifts for these two important Indian Ocean region countries. In Maldives, he declared on February 20th that, earlier India had sent 1 lakh dose, which had been sent within 96 hours of our own vaccine rollout. He said more or less the same thing in Mauritius. In essence, what he said was that the gifts had been given to these countries virtually at the same time that India unrolled its vaccination program. But for me, and this is you will could argue this kind of an opinion, there is one uncomfortable reality. This generosity has deprived 7 million Indians of timely succor, because when you gift away 7 million vaccines, you have deprived 7 million Indians. Even now, there are 17,000 people a day who are falling ill, and 100 are dying daily. 130 is the figure as of yesterday, are dying daily of COVID. My view is that being generous is one thing, but doing it at the cost of Indian lives and suffering is quite another. It's not as though India has been spared of COVID, meaning COVID has, though we have had a lesser proportion of the population infected, we still had 11 million cases. We are only second to the US in the number of cases. So COVID has hit us hard. So though of course the government has claimed that, and the health ministry said that supplies to India will not be affected. But at that point in time, in mid-February, only 8.5 million health workers had been vaccinated at that time. And then on February 21, the SII chief executive Poonawalla had tweeted that his company had been directed. So this wisdom seems to have come slightly later, had been directed to prioritize the huge needs of India, and along with that, balance the needs of the rest of the world. So in the sense that by that concept had come in. Now, of course, we know that what happens is that New Delhi lacks the usual means of lubricating foreign policy. I'm saying if you look at countries like China, they offer grants, loans, or military equipment at friendship prices. So I don't really, in one sense, grudge South Bloc that they have decided to use the instrumentality of vaccines in a pandemic year. And of course, we know that there is a very clear-cut link between geopolitics and vaccine sales, and this becomes manifest when, according to news reports, India has called fellow Quad countries. I mean, today the news said that fellow Quad countries have been asked to invest in Indian production to counter China. So this is being seen as an India versus China kind of thing. Now, of course, there has been some suggestion that India's big-heartedness was linked to India's inability to use the vaccine stocks that it had effectively. And I don't disbelieve that, because my own personal experience in seeking the vaccine probably bears that out. According to the Financial Times vaccine tracker, as of March 7th, India had vaccinated 21 million people, but delivered just 1.5 doses per 100 people. This is amongst the lowest in the world. Ironically, India was behind Maldives, which is 27.5, Seychelles, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and we gave gifts to all these people, yet our own coverage has been lesser than theirs. India has set the target of vaccinating 300 million people by July, but given the current pace, that is unlikely to happen. Most states will miss the target by more than 6 months. India is lagging behind most countries, as I said, as compared to India's 21 million, that is 1.5 per 100. US has vaccinated 90.4 million. China has vaccinated 52.5 million. The EU has vaccinated 40.7 million. And the UK has vaccinated 23 million. Now, why this is important is, and I'm sure the specialist there, Professor Baru herself, that the speed of delivery and the spread of the vaccination is important if the purpose of the exercise, which is to achieve herd immunity, is to be achieved. So in the sense, at some point, the slow rollout in India is going to have an impact, negative impact on us. Now, the question you may well ask is, will vaccine diplomacy or this use of vaccine have a lasting effect? Of course, like all things related to COVID, this is difficult to forecast. But one thing is certain, as a consequence of COVID, countries are rejigging their supply chains so as not to be too dependent on other countries or specific regions for their critical medical supplies. So this is one lesson which I think right from the outset, when this COVID hit, suddenly people realized that everything comes from China. Masks come from China, PPE suits come from China, and there were blockages at that time, and which was a major headache. Doctors in the US were using plastic bags, as to cover their heads as masks. Now, India, of course, sees itself as the vaccine capital of the world, but here there's a bit of a caveat. Actually, even before COVID, it was losing that sheen with competitors like China and South Korea, making a strong showing. And I think the COVID epidemic is likely to encourage other countries also to establish their own facilities, whether it is in critical pharmaceuticals or in critical equipment. I think countries are going to rejig their supply chains, and these supply chains, there will be some element of nearshoring, which is that the US may like to do that in Mexico or in Canada, nearshoring of some kind, or they will reshore certain critical areas. There may be a factor in reshoring. And as I said, this is a very specific lesson from the COVID experience. I think I'll just conclude here, and maybe would be welcome to respond to any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dara and Manoj Joshi. I just want to, I think they both have focused on two very important dimensions of this vaccine diplomacy. It is very clear from both their presentations that one, that it was an opportunity which was used by both countries in a sense, in a competitive sense, in the larger backdrop of the border issues that have been arising. It is also the case that vaccine diplomacy in the Indian context has also been an exercise of soft power and to win friends and to also build a global image. Because if you see the comment that was made by the WHO head, they praised India for actually donating vaccines to their neighbors. But it's also very important, the data that Biswajit provided us about, there was an element of grants, but there was also a commercial angle to expand markets and to have Indian pharma be in the global game, as it were. It is also the case, which Manoj pointed out, and I think these are the gray areas of this area of vaccine diplomacy, is that if you look at the whole entire rollout program in India, there are many more commentators who have written on this in recent times, of what was the preparedness of the health service system, what was the preparedness of the kind of dosage required, the issue of interstate variations in the uptake and the availability of vaccines, including not really having a position on whether to involve the private sector in the delivery of vaccines or not. So we are seeing a situation, and there is a certain level of criticism that when you are not able to have adequate number of dosages to roll out your own vaccine program, you were using the vaccine production, which of course we are in a very good position today, as a diplomatic maneuver. So, I think there is this area in public health where you see this tension between foreign policy or decisions made to support foreign policy and the health ministry and its needs. So I think I see this as a kind of a tension that has arisen at this point in time. But as the whole idea of diplomacy and the vaccine diplomacy is also tied to scientific diplomacy, because I think whether it is the Chinese vaccine or the AstraZeneca or the Covaxin, we've actually produced these vaccines and approved them in an extremely short period of time. We are still debating in the scientific community the efficacy and the safety of these vaccines. So I think there are many of these aspects that come into this area of vaccine diplomacy. But to me, it is an assertion of soft power. It is to build image in the global community. It is also a counter to China to say that, we are here and this is the way we are going to carry this forward. And so therefore, I think both sides are playing and using the card of COVID, the card of vaccine when there is no therapeutics in sight. And we have to see how this unfolds in the coming months. Now, I think I'll open the floor for discussion, questions, and to both the speakers. So please, you can either post it in the chat box or raise your hand and ask your question. Any questions? Any comments? Any disagreements? If there is no question from the participants, may I ask Vishwajit? Yeah, please go ahead.
Good afternoon. This is to Dr. Manoj Joshi. As Dr. Joshi is aware that, on humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, India has made big, strong grounds, and that we sent out help to a lot of nations, especially if you recall the old, when the tsunami struck and subsequently. So do you think in a way, this diplomacy that we are using would also go a long way to establish ourselves as a major player that can assist nations in the time of humanitarian assistance and disaster relief? This, of course, as you would agree, COVID has been a major disaster that the world has faced. Thank you, Manoj. Admiral Muralidhar.
Well, the thing is that we already, since you're a Navy man, you know that in the tsunami, we had played a major role in humanitarian relief. And yes, given our location, given our size, given our capacities, there are and the tsunami proved it very clearly that the speed of action, meaning the speed with which the Indian Navy was able to deploy, was something which other players may not have been able to do, given the location where this problem occurred. So yes, we certainly have a natural, we have certain capacities, and I think Bishwajit spoke of public goods, that the needs of everyone, meaning at the common for all the people in the world. But my issue was specifically with the COVID vaccine because of the unknowns, in the sense that my point was that the idea that if you focus on the national, all countries in the world, if you look at the US, Israel, UK, all these are advanced countries. I mean, they have far more better capacity than ours. all of them are trying to unroll as fast as possible so as to get herd immunity. So this is a specific challenge that they are answering. And my point was that if you are going to give away vaccines while Indians are still, and I, as I pointed out in my figures, that you had one of the lowest rates of, you are lower. Your only plus point is that you are above Pakistan. That's about it, But otherwise, you're lower than everyone, even to the countries you have gifted. So my point is that if you could, in the COVID circumstances, I'm not talking of other areas, tsunamis and other this thing. My understanding is that what you need to do, quick vaccination is needed for herd immunity. And our task was quick vaccination of as many people as possible. And that, I think, by diverting vaccines as gifts, meaning it's all right, meaning public good and all that is fine. But I think first the government's job is to serve the Indian people before serving someone else.
Rama, may I?
Please go ahead.
Yeah. Manoj has been making a very strong pitch for making vaccines available nationally first, and then doing this vaccine diplomacy that India has been. But there are also these issues that we have seen that and there are these anecdotal evidence that one is getting that there is also a considerable amount of vaccine skepticism that is there. So you're not actually looking at a situation where everyone, and this is true for every country, that not everyone is willing to come, is forthcoming in terms of accepting these vaccines. So I think we still don't know that side of the story. How this is panning out, and this could well be because initially in India, the government of India started with this position that it's not going to be exporting any vaccines. Now this was the position in December, January. Early January, that exports of vaccines were all banned, and then there is a shift, and also the issue is something that Rama also mentioned, that our public health infrastructure is not really geared to rolling out these vaccines at a quick pace and covering the population. So there could be, we still have to see how things happen. You have to have more evidence, without which we don't want to make any such statement. That here is a situation where you have vaccines being rolled out by the largest vaccine producing facility, and you don't have that kind of a demand that is going to absorb, because initially Serum Institute was talking about 100 billion doses, and that is not per month, and that's not happening. And we also have heard why it is not happening, because the US is using its own domestic laws to restrict supplies of critical intermediates and stuff like that. So that's becoming another issue there. So I think that Indian situation is a bit tricky in many respects. You can't compare India and China in terms of vaccine rollout, because China has a fantastic public health infrastructure, and for China to have to not go as far as it did in rolling out the vaccines or covering their own population, that's a bit of a surprise. I'm not very surprised about India. Maybe Rama has to say something about that.
There are a couple more questions. Is it realistic for India and South Africa to seek total suspension of the IP regime on account of the COVID-19 pandemic? Maybe Bishwajit, you can take that.
Yeah, see, there have been, we have been talking about flexibilities in this intellectual property regime ever since the TRIPS agreement actually came in. And, after the HIV/AIDS pandemic, I was mentioning that additional flexibilities were introduced in the intellectual property regime. And of course, some of them worked, some of them didn't work. And I think it's important to recognize that, something that India and other countries have been, developing countries have been emphasizing, that IP can be a major barrier. And I think people need to understand, if they don't understand in these COVID times that, IP can be a barrier. Of course, we're not talking about a permanent waiver. We're not saying that, none of these should ever be applied, and that's not the case. So at least till the time that the pandemic lasts, there should be availability of these medicines and vaccines and other medical products. Manoj was talking about all the other PPEs and all those. Also, there was a shortage of these as well. So these should be available to the global community. So has to be, I think a very clear choice has to be made by the Committee of Nations, that do you actually allow this kind of excessive rent seeking at a time when people don't have access to medicines and vaccines, or would you have business as usual? And that is the moral question that is being asked. We don't know which way the wind is going to blow, but I think there is a very strong argument that India and South Africa, both other countries are making at this point. That's all I can say.
There's another question. How do the Indian and Chinese vaccine diplomacies differ? I think both of you can take this question.
Manoj can go first. No?
Yeah, well, I think, in the sense, I think from what I can make out, that the scale of the Chinese program is much, much larger. As I gave you the example of that, and we're only seeing the edge of it. The Chinese have set up this gigantic facility in Addis Ababa, which has one part of it is a cold storage as big as a football field, and the other part of it is a control room where they monitor the temperature of the vaccine modules. And this facility will be used then to service the Chinese programs in Africa and other places. And I suspect they will also make in Latin America. So I suspect that the sheer scale, but the Chinese also have a clear commercial edge in their exports, because they have something like 17 vaccines which they are developing, and many of them are from government-owned facilities. So the Chinese are very clearly, because in the case of India, none of them are government. The Indian vaccines are all private sector vaccines, and the government as such is unlikely to promote them, for their exports. But in the case of China, there is a certain interest of backing that, and of course, there's a very clear understanding that to take as much advantage of this situation as you can from this export to become a dominant player. Meaning, like in many other businesses, I think the Chinese are also looking here. Their problem is they never managed to get a vaccine. First of all, they were not the first to have the vaccine rollout, and the Americans beat them to it. And also the quality of the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccine, of course, they require deep freeze and all that. Again, turned out to be much better than what the Chinese have offered. So far, we actually have no real estimate of what are the phase 3 trials have provided for the Chinese vaccines. Even our own Covaxin, only phase 2 trials results are really known in any state. So I think there is in short, what the fact the Chinese is likely to be much more commercial and a much larger venture, much larger and sustained venture. In our case, I don't think it will be beyond a point. The government will not, make this as a kind of a government issue to promote the Covishield, which of course is a British-Swedish vaccine.
Yeah, I entirely agree with Manoj that I don't think we can compare the two. I think the scales are really not comparable. And what will be very important, as and I can very clearly say this, that like for instance in one part, in one aspect of the pharmaceutical industry, for instance, supplying the active pharmaceutical ingredients or the bulk drugs, where the Chinese have a complete control over the global market. Um, One can foresee if all these vaccines, these 17 vaccines that Manoj is talking about, Chinese vaccines, if even half of them actually fructify, they become commercially successful, then China is going to be the largest vaccine supplier of the world, and in the world, and much of what India is doing, this India is what Manoj was talking about. I think China is going to be a very strong competitor, if not, sort of surpass India. So like every other area that we are seeing where the Chinese have really stolen a march, we are now set to see the Chinese stealing a march in the area of vaccines as well. Because again, in what Manoj was saying, that in the India's contribution in the supply in the supplies of critical vaccines is well recognized, and WHO sort of wholeheartedly recognizes India's contribution. Maybe things will get much more tempered as we go along.
I'd just like to add that, I think both Manoj and Vishwajit have raised a very, very important issue, which is that vaccine diplomacy, as we are discussing it today, the background for a lot of that is scientific diplomacy. And if you look at the kind of collaborations that the Chinese have engaged with American scientists, American labs prior to the Wuhan outbreak, it's very, very interesting. It's been years of sustained investment by America in building Chinese capacity, building labs which are collaborative labs. So the science of this, the scientific basis of a lot of these are in the public sector. And there is a huge investment you see in China, which you don't see in India. I think it is a great commentary that the Indian private sector, the pharmaceutical sector, has become a vaccine leader. But the kind of investment that will be required to be cutting edge, like the Chinese, and then to be able to play the global market, I don't think we're going to be able to compare the two at all. And I think this is a very, very important aspect. You have NIH grants to Chinese laboratories. You may have a cooling off of the Sino-American relationship today and prior to Biden, the Trump era. But, they are highly networked. The Chinese and the American labs are highly networked. The science of all of this is through collaborative research, not just with the Americans, but they have other European partners as well. We do not see that kind of equivalent situation in the Indian context. Where is the public sector money for high-end research and science today?
Yeah, Rama, I didn't want to touch on that, because that's the topic for another, sort of webinar as to what kind of advances China is making in scientific research and medical research in particular. And this is absolutely amazing, because if I don't have that thing, I have this information about the vaccine research that is going on at this point in time. There are more than 160 projects that are going on. And then you can see the kind of collaboration that China is engaged in. And you're absolutely correct, that the government is backing that research. You can't really have this, because you can't really have this kind of results, because quite clearly one of the things that has been proved very clearly, that unless the government, and this has happened in the Western countries as well, the kind of federal funding that has come into vaccine and the COVID, both vaccines and medicines, is absolutely mind-boggling. And Europe, you can have the same kind of a thing. So one thing is very clear, that the one big lesson that one learns is that unless there is a big public sector push, government push, you can't actually get results at the end of the pipeline. And then like I said at the beginning, that if the objective is to make to treat these products as public goods, then one of the ways in which you can do it, I think the best way that you can do it is to have the government come in and fund these projects, and then you can make a case for cheaper medicines and vaccines at the end of the day. But that's something that's completely missing here. And I don't think that there is any inclination here to really come in and plug that big gaping hole, because that the public sector hole is becoming even larger. I think there is very little interest in really investing in public sector at this point in time.
Rama, can I make a point here on this?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, the point I wanted to make was that another big difference is that in the case of India, we've got this vaccine, which is AstraZeneca, which is a Swedish British product. And so that's the one which we exported in a large volume. Of course, the COVAX has just about now got the second phase trial approval. Not approval, but has been cleared by Lancet at least. The point I'd like to make is that in the Chinese case, what has happened is that now 17 of their vaccines, as I said, are in clinical trials in some 60 countries. Now, the interesting thing is that in many of these trials, the Chinese are collaborating with local research institutes. So what has happened is that if it's Sinopharm or what if Sinovac or whatever it is, so in many of these countries, they are developing linkages for this vaccine production with local scientific institutes. For example, in Brazil, that was what the controversy was, meaning the governor of that Sao Paulo, he had backed something which is a Chinese vaccine, which was through an institute out there. And the president didn't like it, so he asked India for the vaccine. And we, of course, supplied it to him. So, but it brought out the fact that what the Chinese are doing is that they are really, as Vishwajit pointed out, looking to see the next stage, in the sense by these collaborations that they have already instituted with these 17 vaccines. This would be a kind of a stepping stone to closer scientific collaborations with these institutes in the future for other areas.
Any other questions? Okay, there is one more question. If China can sell its vaccines, then why doesn't India do it?
I think Vishwajit is the best person to answer that.
Yeah, but India is selling its vaccines. Yeah. So in fact, the larger part of our, if you look at the total supply, the vaccines we have exported, as I said, that 58 million doses have been exported till today. 34 million have been done commercially, 34 million doses. So, well above half actually gone commercially. So we are not, initially we had, government had problems exporting the vaccines, but now is not there anymore.
I think Hemant has raised his hand. Hemant, please ask your question.
Yeah. Thank you, Rama. Sorry, I'm keeping my video off because of the connectivity issues. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. So I just wanted to make a quick comment about the vaccines and the IP aspect, because Vishwajit also had pointed that out. I just wanted to say that I don't know, I'm not aware of the official position taken by the Chinese government on the this joint move by India and South Africa about these 4 areas of IP-related concerns, which Vishwajit pointed out. But I've seen a series of articles. In fact, today also a Chinese economist has written an article welcoming this joint initiative by India and South Africa, and has used actually very strong words that especially directed at the developed countries of imposing this IP factor in the vaccine. Especially, they are saying that this thing is nothing less than hooliganism on the part of the developed countries. That's the language he has used, and the reason the Chinese economist has given is that this hooliganism will also deprive the developing countries and many other poorer countries in different parts of the world to implement the herd immunity, because if they don't have access for their population for the vaccine jabs, then they're actually being deprived of the herd immunity, which will be completely then confined to the developed countries and their own population. So they see, some Chinese commentators see actually some kind of a conspiracy behind this. So it's not just simply IP for profit-making point of view, but also an evil design. That's what the Chinese commentators are saying. Thank you.
Hemant, see, China is really torn between two ends today, because China is really has a huge interest in protecting his IP. It's the Chinese Patent Office is the largest patent office in the world today, and 80% of the patents that are applied every year are applied by the Chinese nationals. So you can understand, what kind of interest China has in protecting its IP. And my interactions, with the Chinese scholars who are working on pharmaceutical industry, I can hear, the echo of what the Americans actually, it's talking about the Indian pharmaceutical companies, generic industry, saying that they're actually copying technology and stuff like that. I've actually heard this from the Chinese scholars as well. So China is in a very curious situation. So we have to wait and watch how China sort of comes out. If it does formally come and become a co-sponsor. Until then, we'll never know what kind of support in China is lending. But I'll be very skeptical if China actually goes out and supports in the manner that other countries have.
Manoj, would you like to say something?
I would broadly agree with Bishwajit. I'm saying if you look at the trend in the Chinese system, it is definitely towards reinforcing intellectual property, meaning because they feel that the phase has now come where they must innovate and they must be dependent on the economy must be dependent on innovative products. So I also agree that now it's possible in certain set of circumstances that the central government in Beijing decides that we need to make this gesture. But I really don't see it, because even in the case of their grants and loans and things like that, meaning people make a big thing about debt trap diplomacy and all that. Well, the Chinese are pretty hard-headed when it comes to getting their money back and their business kind of approach to these things. But of course, as I said, it's linked to the current phase of their system. In the current phase, they are emphasizing an economy which looks more and more like, which wants to be more and more like that of the United States or of Europe, depending to making money out of innovation, innovative products, high-end products. And so maybe if there's a low-end vaccine, meaning if they think if out of those 17 vaccines, they might offer 3, 4, and say, okay, no intellectual property. But if they have something which is very good, something, like Johnson & Johnson's thing, which has a high rate, efficiency rate, plus it's a single shot vaccine, something like that, they're unlikely to do so. Because, we also have to understand that this vaccine business is going to be ongoing. I don't think you are going to, that you get your vaccine in 2021 and that's it. So this is something, it could very well be like your flu shots and all that, which you have to take every year, which means money. I mean, say in the US, for example, you get a flu shot September, October. You can go to the nearest supermarket, you get it for $30. A lot of people simply go there, get their shot, but $30 is a lot of money. $30 in the developing world, meaning if you have an effective single shot vaccine, because right now we are looking at the brands, but at some point or the other, one or the other is going to win out. One or two or three of those others, people are going to say, no, I think that is the least amount of, because right now none of the vaccines have gone through a full year. Full year of knowledge about what are the side effects, what could be the negative, drawbacks, etc. So this is something, this vaccine diplomacy, if you want to call it, the vaccine exports, etc. This is the game that has just begun.
Absolutely. Both Biswajit and Manoj, I think, have really laid out the complex terrain. The fact of the matter is that we have these vaccines. The vaccine game has just begun because we are also looking at variants in the COVID, the virus. And we already know the UK strain, God knows how many other strains are going to now come out. And this is not going to be a one-shot affair that you get this, whichever one you get, the Covaxin or the Covishield. But it is going to, and we don't even know what the period of immunity coverage you're going to get. How many months are you going to get coverage? So it would mean that you would have to have research in understanding how to deal with the variants that will come up, and also to look at how many doses you would require maybe for the next couple of years. So it is a big game. It is a game of the market. It is about, also about vaccine nationalism. And the vaccine diplomacy is just one part of the larger story. And I think we're really going to have to wait and watch how it unfolds. I want to say thank you very much to both Professor Dhar and Dr. Joshi. I think it has opened a very interesting area of work, and as you can see, it's a very complex terrain. We can say vaccine diplomacy, soft power, that being just what we see today. But there is this entire area of scientific enterprise, the pharmaceutical sector, public investments in both research and the health service system. Those are the important lessons that we needed to take away from COVID-19. But the hype and hope of vaccine diplomacy actually opens a very, very important area of interdisciplinary engagement. And I hope that it'll be an area for future work, collaborative work between scholars from different disciplines. Thank you so much. And on behalf of the Institute of Chinese Studies, I want to say thank you to both the speakers and to the audience, and for all the questions that have been raised. Thank you. Mr. Kant, would you like to say something before we conclude?
No, Rama, that's fine. Thank you very much. Let me also
thank you.
Thank Vishwajit and Manoj and Rama.
Thank you very much.
Wonderful seminar.